Hello, everybody, and welcome to another World of Warcraft live developer Q&A. My name is Josh Allen, aka Community Manager Lore. Joining me once again, Game Director Ion Hazzikostas. Ion, thanks so much for being here.
Great as always. Glad to be back answering some questions in the community.
Yeah,
Looking
definitely.
forward to all the hot topics. Going to talk some pet battles, new first aid content, transmogs. I mean, really, there isn't much else going on. We figure we can kind of delve into some of these less explored niche topics. Just kind of give them some attention too.
You see
Pet
what I'm
battles
dealing
need some
with?
love.
Do you see what I'm dealing with?
What?
But no, we have a lot of really... Don't listen to him. We have a lot of really great questions lined up for today. I do want to mention real quick before we get started that we actually have several Q&As coming up in the very near future. The next one of which will be in just a couple of weeks, and that's going to be a very PvP-focused Q&A with Brian Halinka. And immediately following that, we're actually going to have a little announcement from the esports team as well, talking about the 2017 esports program. So definitely keep an eye out for that Q&A in just a couple of weeks. Again, that's going to be a PvP-focused one with Brian Halinka. Followed by an esports 2017 program announcement. So that should be really cool. But before we talk about anything else, we should probably bring up a question to talk about. This first one comes from Etzrin, who asked, are there any plans to make the balance of power skins account-wide in the future? And if not, can we expect to see further alt catch-up mechanisms?
Okay, so yeah, we've definitely heard a lot about this. Recently made some hotfix changes to the Emerald Nightmare step. Getting those corrupted essences was really a huge bottleneck. We're not currently planning to make it account-wide. I think when we created these unlocks, by and large, they're weapon-specific, character-specific, and if you want the PvP appearance, you need to get honor, get those prestige levels on a given character. They're purely cosmetic rewards. They're meant to reflect your actions and your accomplishments on that one character. That said, I think we're certainly looking at the number of steps and how arduous any individual step is, especially as some of the content involved, such as Emerald Nightmare, no longer feels like it's current relevant content.
Right.
And I think the change we made there, we literally, I think, increased the drop rate by something like 5x, 6x.
Yeah.
There's you can go and finish it in just a couple of weeks, whereas before it took months. And then the other steps are just doing dungeons, which remain relevant, which we're continuing to update in future patches going forward, as well as the Nighthold raid, and that step is pretty quick. So I think we want to make sure that it's not an unreasonable ask, but its design was character-specific from the start.
Do you think there's a possibility later on, like once Nighthold is no longer considered to be current relevant content, like after Tomb of Sargeras comes out, do you think there's a possibility of speeding up the rate from Nighthold as well? Given that that's kind of the last step of the chain?
That's certainly possible, though, already the drop rate is pretty high relative to the number that you need. I think a lot of people just finish it in 2 or 3 weeks, but it could be even faster.
Cool. Next question comes from Sivation, who asked, 30 Il'gynoth kills across all difficulties and still no hidden shadow appearance. When will bad luck protection be added for these? So correct me if I'm wrong. I think most of these have it at this point.
Yes, it was
was
added.
pretty recent.
It was added in patch 7.1.5. Unfortunately, it's not retroactive. So if you're talking about 30 Il'gynoth kills, a lot of that probably stretches back to late 2016, when yes, it was just purely luck based. There was no protection there. At this point, though, any of the hidden appearances that come from raid bosses or dungeon bosses that are just rare drops, you will be guaranteed to get it eventually, and your odds improve significantly with repeated attempts. Unfortunately, there was no way to make that, just the way the system works, to make it retroactive, to have it take into account kills that happened before the system was put in place.
Cool. And just to tie this into the previous question as well, talking about like the balance of power chain and alt catch-up mechanics, is this the sort of thing that you think we'll be looking at to make easier for alts in the future? Or is this more of a, like, no, you really need to dedicate yourself to this to get it?
I think in general, we want to make sure that none of the things are reaching the point of being just frustrating.
Right.
But ultimately, these are purely cosmetics, right? I think when we talk about catch-up, when we talk about alt friendliness, alt accessibility, I think we more tend to look at things like getting geared up, getting your artifact power, getting your artifact knowledge, getting your first legendary, things that make you feel like you can't play the character competitively or do the content you want to do until you get them done. This is just a cosmetic unlock, so it's kind of a different category in terms of how we approach it.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Next question comes from Pig or Hen, who I always like answering questions from because his name entertains me. His or her name entertains me. The question is, do you think the 715 secondary weight changes were adequate or successful? Because the impact did not seem uniform, and an 860 Arcana Crystal still beats Trinkets up to 900 plus for some classes.
So I think overall the changes were successful. We're happy with how it played out in terms of narrowing a lot of those gaps, making eye level more frequently the determining factor when it comes to upgrades, certainly when you're talking about large eye level differences, making some really undervalued secondary stats better for some folks. Arcana Crystal is a little bit of a special case. I think there's no question that in Legion, for various reasons, the power difference between primary and secondary stats is much narrower than it ever has been in the past. We did a little bit to undo that in 715, but it's not something we actually can meaningfully change during the course of the expansion without just completely throwing existing item balance and distribution out of whack,
right?
Which we're hesitant to do in the middle of an expansion. But Arcana Crystal, it was deliberately over budget because it was the product of item creation philosophies that dated back to past expansions, where we found that anytime we made a trinket that didn't have primary stats on it, it was universally viewed as terrible. And so the idea of making this is just a simple trinket that's kind of wacky. It just has 4 different secondary stats on it, and that's it. Or all the different secondary stats on it, and that's it. We thought it needed to be over budget. Obviously, as a lot of other things changed, as our item budgets changed, as our class balance came into focus, that ended up being significantly overpowered. There's no real way to fix that without nerfing valued trinkets out from under people, which we're hesitant to do. I think the way Arcana Crystal was played out, there's something, it's kind of, there's something nice and exciting about Withered Gym Week and the spectacle that is Withered Gym Week. But I think it's something that's naturally going to fall out of favor and prominence simply because of the fact that it is stuck at 860.
Right.
And while, yes, it compares favorably to some Nighthold trinkets, when Tomb of Sargeras comes out, well, that's going to be much, much less likely. I mean, you might still kill Wither Jim every week he's up, hoping to win the lottery and get that ridiculous Titan Forged version of it. But those become moments of, surprise and excitement for the handful of people who get those items. Whereas for most people, you're increasingly going to want to look to the current tier's trinkets as your most reliable source of good items.
So basically, the gap is kind of a little bit large right now, but as time goes on, it'll be less of a problem as new trinkets come out and so on.
Exactly. I think the likelihood of getting that Arcana Crystal that actually is worth equipping in later patches will be lower. And the reason why to fix it would involve just nerfing the Arcana Crystal or massively buffing all the other trinkets in the game, neither of which feel like good solutions to a problem that we think is going to diminish in time naturally.
Okay. Next question comes from Brunick on Twitter, who asked, what's the reason behind making the second trait on Relics another layer of RNG? So I guess to make sure everybody's up to speed on this one, there are new Relics in patch 7.2 that can have 2 traits on them. The first trait is set.
It's not actually new relics.
It's not actually new relics.
There is.
See, now I'm learning something.
Yeah, sorry.
Too.
So there are 2 additional. So shortly in patch 7.2, you will complete the next step of your Order Hall campaign, which will give you a new champion, increase the number of champion slots you have, and also unlock 2 more tiers of research in your Order Hall. The final research tier basically adds a second trait to all relics.
Oh, okay.
So it's not just because otherwise we'd be creating a world where only the new 7.2 content dropped relics that were desirable, whereas things like Warforging, Titan Forging, World Quests, the Mythic Plus system, all of those things are designed to be evergreen and keep all those items relevant. So this is something that will just affect all max level relics in Legion once you have it.
Cool.
But yes, there will. And so once you have this trait unlocked, relics that you obtain will have 2 traits on them as opposed to merely 1. So the reason why this is another layer of RNG is it actually serves to create many more opportunities and possibilities for attractive and desirable relics. And it sort of averages out the gap or the potential gaps between what would otherwise be really large swings in power between the best and worst relics if they were fixed and handcrafted. So if you imagine, a new raid zone comes out and there are 3 holy relics in it for you. If those have specific trait combinations, then the potential for the best to be far better than the worst is actually doubled compared to how it used to be. And we already have seen problems with traits outweighing item level on the relics, where we largely want eye level to be the determining factor. Also, there are some specific cases, like right now, for example, I think if you're a Retribution Paladin and you really want those Avenging Wrath traits because those are pretty much the best thing out there for you, there's, I think, only one Fire Relic or something at max level that modifies that. And so people tend to run the same dungeon over and over again with their Mythic Keystones, just trying to get that one relic or get a good Warforged version of it, because that's just the limitations of a handcrafted system when there's only a fixed possibility.
Right. Okay.
Versus in 7.2 in this world, well, now any relic has the chance of having that. And so rather than, going into a boss, looking at its loot table, deciding that that relic isn't really for you, and not having any interest or any hope of getting a good item from it, there's the possibility that it could be exciting, and could be an upgrade. So I think ultimately this is more possibilities. It's more layers of customization, especially if you have, legendaries that have suggested pushed you down the road for a certain build and make you favor some traits over others, and there previously weren't good relics that modified those traits that you wanted to double down on. Well, now there can be, because it just lets us get more possibilities and combinations out there without manually making 15 different relics and just cluttering up the loot tables in much the same way.
Or specifically putting the best trait on every single relic in the game, which would just be kind of dull.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Cool. And though it's also one other note there, the extra trait that rolls on these relics, it will always be a throughput trait.
Oh,
It will never be, so if you're using the Ret Paladin example again, you will never get extra Flash of Light healing as your bonus one. It's only going to pull from the ones that we consider primary role enhancing traits. Obviously, some are better than others, but it should narrow the overall gap in power between the best and worst relics out there, which is another one of our goals.
Okay, cool. So you're not going to roll like increased Flash of Light, and I don't remember what the other one is for Ret Paladin, but yeah. So okay, cool. And one other technical question about this that just came up while you were talking about this, and I was just thinking about: is it possible for it to roll the same trait that's already on the relic?
Okay, it will always be a different one. You can't double up.
So you're not going to be hoping for. I've got 3 relics, all of which have double Avenging Wrath traits on them.
No, plus 3 is the most that you can ever get from your relics to a given trait.
Okay, cool. Moving on. Next question. This actually kind of ties into it as well. Comes from Del Lariel on Twitter, who asked, any chance we can see more relic drops or options? Currently choosing only by item level would be nice to choose by trait.
I think this largely is covered by the answer to the last question. I think that in addition to adding new relics with a new tier, a new zone comes out, the fact that we're bumping up the base item level of dungeons keeps all of those things relevant. So there should be a greater variety than ever before of relic options when it comes to that first trait. But the variability in the second trait should actually give you far more potential options for the specific traits you want to chase after.
Okay. All right, let's just move on then. Next question comes from Perry X about my personal favorite topic, which is Legendaries, who asked, how come Legendary items don't change their effect with the specializations, just like tier sets do nowadays? I'm sure you guys considered that during the development, and what were the bad sides of that?
So, sure, I totally get that. Obviously, if you're a player looking to play multiple specs, you wish that, this pair of bracers that you had could just morph and be the great legendary for each individual spec. That would obviously be a quality of life improvement for you. Completely understood. I think the reasons why we shy away from taking that approach, I think we consider what we've done with tier sets or with things like the trinkets from Archimond at the end of Hellfire Citadel. I think we see that as something of a concession. I think there is value, especially when we're talking about rare and individual items, in reinforcing the identity of the item. When you see or you hear someone get Marquee Bindings of the Sun King, those are the Pyro Bracers. There's an item that's named, that has a description, that has a fantasy to it, and it enhances a specific ability. When you see someone get Pride As, you know what Pride As does. Versus everything being a bit muddied, where this item could do 3 or 4 different things depending on whether you're balance or feral or restoration. There also isn't necessarily one-to-one parity between which slots are filled by which spec legendaries. We would have had to go down that road. So I think instead we did that with tier sets. We did that with things in raids in particular because of the realities of group loot and master loot and those options that are available for loot distribution, that having something that is so narrow that it only works for one specific spec that you then need to assign out to people in a group, it's very likely there's no one of that spec present, which is a pretty negative experience overall. Versus Legendaries are inherently personal drops no matter what your loot setting, and so we can always guarantee that it's always going to be useful, and presumably it's useful to the spec that you're playing, the spec that you have as your loot spec, and so it's targeted in that way.
Okay. Let's move on. Next question from Ankle Shanker, who asked, any plans for reducing the large barrier to spec swapping presented by Legendaries? Having multiple Legendaries for a single slot is just yet another mechanic that makes it different to play multiple specs. Okay, so I don't actually fully understand what the second sentence is about. I'm guessing maybe they're kind of thinking like, almost sort of tying into the previous question, like maybe thinking about like I can have bracers for subtlety or bracers for assassination.
Right, and then I guess if you were to switch specs and then get also bracers, then now you only have one legendary you can effectively wear.
Sure,
I guess that there's definitely some potential awkwardness there if that happens to play out that way for you.
Assuming that's what they meant.
And that's one of those where it's almost impossible, to not have some slot overlap between 4 different specs and trying to make a certain number of legendaries across the board.
Sure.
But with regard to spec swapping and legendaries in general, I know this is a topic that increasingly has been subject of a lot of discussion, and something that I think we considered a mandatory problem to at least work towards solving, because it is a real one. If you, for whatever reason, whether it's because you're trying to chase what you see as the best or highest performing spec, or whether it's because you've been playing ARMS all expansion, but the tank in your raid group that used to be your reliable off tank just had a schedule change and can't make the raids anymore, and you need to step up in tank now and go protection. Well, oops, both of your legendaries are DPS ARMS legendaries.
Right.
Do you feel like you're holding the guild back at that point?
Yeah.
Because you don't have them. So what we're doing in 7.2, we're actually making, and there's always, I understand it's not a super transparent system, but the way the legendary drop rates and the associated bad luck protection works, we're making that much more spec specific versus the current system that currently exists in place today, where it looks more at how many legendaries for a given spec are still available for you to get rather than how many you have. So using the mage example again, if you have the Pyro Bracers and the Scorch Belt and you switch to Frost, as far as the system is concerned, you have 0 legendaries now because you have 0 Frost usable legendaries that would drop for a Frost mage, and so your drop rates for getting your first couple of legendaries in that spec are going to be significantly higher as a result. Okay. Again, it's not a silver bullet. There's still going to be that period of time where you feel like you are underperforming or you're weaker than you could be if you were fully up to par in terms of legendaries, but it should significantly reduce the friction and should get people to the level they want to be at and to a competitive level much, much faster than before.
Yeah, and especially like once you've gotten a couple legendaries that you're sort of satisfied with for your main spec, even if they're not necessarily the absolute best ones, like if you're, again, using the mage example, like you've got the Pyro Bracers and the Scorch Belt, like they're pretty good, but maybe not what you would consider to be the absolute best. Maybe you want the Time Warp Ring or something. But then sometimes you want to spend... Sorry. I guess, yeah. Man, cuts me deep right there. But maybe sometimes you want to switch to Frost and you want to play Frost instead for certain encounters or something. This would then give you that opportunity to say, okay, I'm happy with what I'm at least satisfied with what I've got for Fire. I can switch over, and then obviously that works pretty well for other classes that have multiple roles that they can play too.
Yes,
that's pretty cool. Next question is a good one. It comes from. I really need to learn to read the names of people before I actually do these things so that I can know what they are when I try to say them. WebKR3B5, I guess?
Krebs?
Webkrebs?
Anyway.
Okay. This comes from Webkrebs, who says, any plans on buffing underperforming legendaries? Enhancement bracers, for example, do literally nothing right now.
Well, they don't do literally nothing. So I think in the specific example of the enhancement bracers, I think those rely on Frostbrand. And if that's not the build that you're using, then yes, it may actually do nothing for you, or it may push you into a build that feels like it's suboptimal or underperforming and actually isn't raising your overall throughput. That's an example of a legendary that probably just is undertuned and that we should buff. That's something we're continuing to do, to look at, the low-end ones and bring them up a bit, look at the high-end ones and bring them down a little bit. The tweak the time warp ring that I just mentioned, that's coming up in 7.2.
Yeah.
Part of the problem, we knew when we made our last round of changes that it was on the high end, but there wasn't a tuning knob really. It was just very binary. It was just your time warp ignores temporal displacement, period. By now giving you a slightly weaker time warp when you're under the effect of temporal displacement, that actually lets us balance it to a point where it's still very good, but it's not dominant over the other legendaries.
Right.
And so, yeah, these bracers would be something that, would be a target for that on the other end. On the high end, I think the Frost Death Knight Helm is another one that's on our radar, just FYI. But all of that said, I think there's some interesting value in legendaries that do feel like they push you into a specific build or a specific talent choice that otherwise wouldn't have been optimal. Obviously, we just need to tune the numbers to make sure that it's not actually a net loss to do that. But getting an item and feeling like, oh, okay, even though the normal rotation or the normal priority or the normal talent for my class would be this legendary makes this other one amazing, and that's something that really impacts my gameplay in a way that we would love for items to do more.
Cool. Yeah, and I think it's worth sort of hammering home the thought that a lot of what we see as the issue with legendaries right now isn't so much the way you acquire them, but very much that you can get one that you just think is awful, and then you're sad that you got one that was awful. So we talk about legendaries a lot. We talk about legendary balance a lot. You mentioned a couple changes have already happened in 7.2. There's more coming that we're talking about.
I think we're just chipping away at that, right? I think it was great to see. There was a whole lot of Pride as use on Mythic Nighthold's cutting edge progression.
Yeah,
turns out
really
that
good
mix
now.
of the extra secondary stats give it a solid offensive value, but when you're playing at the very limits of what your healers can keep up with and trying to do as much throughput as possible, turns out that a defensive value actually does increase DPS by making you not die.
Cool.
But yeah, we know there's more to do and further tweaks that can be made to other ones that still aren't as exciting as they could be.
Cool. Yeah, I just want to mention, because I get asked about it a lot, Resto Druid Shoulders is another one that we're looking into. So there, I'll just mention that. Question from Letho, who asked, as many classes' ability to maintain competitiveness is dependent on having a best-in-slot legendary combination, what are your plans to fix the problem of unlucky players being uncompetitive and bench by progression rate? So yeah, this is kind of what we were just saying as well, in that it just ties into, well, the problem there is that some legendaries aren't as good as they should be, so we'll try and adjust those.
I think that's a huge part of it, right? I think it's narrowing those gaps. I think increasingly, and the ones that are the most problematic in our eyes, I think, as we mentioned during our last pass on legendary tuning in 7.1.5, are the ones that just feel like they're universally the best. Something like Sefu's at this point, I think, is in a good place in that there are some fights where, especially if you're on interrupt duty, or especially if you are regularly dispelling on a given fight as a healer, you put on your Sefu's and you're happy to do that. It's like when you do Botanist, if there's one healer that's specifically dispelling fetters and parasitic fetter every time, that's a great Sefu's fight for that healer. But you wouldn't necessarily use it in other fights. And that's a better place for them to be overall, rather than there to ever feel like there is the one universally dominant choice. Separately, and I know this is a murkier area, I think the definition of competitive is one that is, I think, very subject to debate. You might be a few percent behind, but I think the reality is, for many classes and for most specs, that's well within the margin of error on just natural variance in your performance from fight to fight. Of course, you'd always like to do the highest, Simcraft DPS if you are in a min-maxing mindset. But I think guilds that are benching good players because their theoretical sim throughput is just a few percent lower than what they might want, I think are probably not making the right choice. You're good players, I think, as any raid leader, any guild leader can attest. Good players who consistently show up, are positive in their mentality, don't fail at mechanics, all of those things, they're valuable and hard to find. I would question that choice if that's the road that a lot of players are feeling like they're going down. That probably isn't actually the best thing for their group's success.
Right. Be nicer to Todd, basically.
Pretty much. Poor Todd.
Poor Todd. Poor guy. He's great. Okay, moving on. Next question from Altieri, who asked, what are the plans for the craftable legendaries? And do you think there will be more than the 4 slated to come out in 7.2?
So I mean, the plans, yes, these are have made an appearance on the PTR. We currently just have the 4 planned. It's one cloth, one leather, one mail, one plate. The goal here was actually first and foremost not necessarily about targeted legendaries. It was more making something exciting for the crafting professions to produce. I think there was this sense that after the very early game, for the first 3 weeks of the expansion, before the item level cap went up, before raids opened, crafted gear that you could buff through Obliterum felt very valuable. There was a lot of very active market in those items. Whereas increasingly over time, that's become less and less the case because there's so many other opportunities out there to get gear. Whereas professions like alchemy are still incredibly lucrative, inscription making, glyphs, and other things. There are plenty of ways that players feel like they can make things, engage with the market, engage with their profession. So these crafted legendaries exist primarily to be really exciting things for players to craft and sell that will be lucrative, that will have value, that will let them feel like there's something that they offer that's significant and important as a blacksmith. Now, like that said, in terms of designing them and balancing them, we aim for them to be pretty solid middle of the road legendaries. None of these should be your best in slot choice in any circumstance. If you're looking to just min-max your DPS on Croesus or something, but they have extra sockets to kind of further reinforce that profession orientation, and that's where a lot of their extra throughput bonus comes from. And then their other effects are more utility based and convenience. And certainly, if you're someone who doesn't have legendaries at all, these are a great place to start. Or if you feel like you like the particular effect they offer, well, hit up your friendly crafter or be a crafter yourself.
Sure. And I kind of have 2 follow-up questions for you there as well, or 2 thoughts, I guess. One of them is that, like, we were just talking about Cephas a minute ago, and how that's one that we can see as people get more legendaries, they can sort of swap in their Cephas in some situations and then swap it out later. Lots of people at this point have like 3 or 4 legendaries, so they can already kind of do that. But this, I think, kind of helps in that as well. Like, if you have a Cephas and you're going into a fight where there's just, I cannot proc this on this fight, then having a craftable legendary will give you a nice sort of backup option as well there. Which is cool.
Yeah, same deal if you have like an AoE-oriented legendary on a fight like Croesus, right? You just could go for the more reliable stat stick option.
Cool. The other thought I had, just to clarify, these don't count against your drop chances or
no
protection,
yes.
right?
No,
okay.
these are created and completely they're not dropped. There's no interaction there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just wanted to. I was predicting in my head people going, "I crafted a legendary and now my drop chance is lower." And it doesn't happen. Okay, cool.
Don't worry, legendary follower items don't either. Like, it's
yes. All right, next question from Forte, who asked, why do developers insist on making AP a long-term system when it has so much effect on the game? Like, why do you insist on making AP?
Pesky developers.
Long-term.
We insist on doing things that affect the game. Sorry. So I think a lot of this has been laid out in some of the recent posts that I made, that Josh made on the PTR forums, talking about where we feel like we went wrong in 7.0, 7.1 Artifact Power, what we're doing differently in 7.2. I think that the thing we wanted to offer with Artifact Power was a universally desired currency, a way of progressing and improving your character, and making some choices along the way as you pick which trait you want to purchase first, second, as you kind of navigate your way through the artifact tree. And so whenever you run a dungeon, if you don't get a piece of loot that drops for you, at least you walk away with tangible progress having been made towards a goal, towards being a little bit stronger. And we think that overall, we've tried different systems like this in the past, right? Whether it's Valor points, other things. There's a lot of value to a combination of random loot rewards and predictable, determined, steady progress towards a goal. So again, whenever you're playing, no matter what you're doing, you never feel like you just wasted your time. You feel like even if you got unlucky with drops, you're closer to a goal. And I think if that's the case at some points in the game, why shouldn't it be the case at all points? If the game is better in September and October for you having those choices and those options, why should it stop being that way in January?
Sure.
And so, to some extent, the fact the system had an attainable endpoint the first time around led to 2 problems. It led to people, I think. So, okay, I'll have a separate tangent. I'll go on after this. But I think it led to people feeling like, well, there was a clear finish line that they needed to race towards. And if they weren't there, they were falling behind and they were, short of some objective completion point. And then once they got there, now for many cases, if you don't have any need for artifact power anymore, that extra motivation, that extra little bit of reward is no longer present.
Right.
When you kill a raid boss and it doesn't drop anything for you, and you get an artifact power item that you vendor for 100 gold, you got 100 gold, but that's not particularly exciting, versus, oh, hey, I actually filled a bubble in this bar, getting me closer to this goal. And so I think separately, though, I totally understand the mindset of wanting to be free from the obligation to grind, from the sense of, I must continue running Mythic Plus dungeons. I must do my 50th Mauve Souls of the week, or my raid leader is going to beat me. And that's, and I totally get wanting freedom from that, wanting an endpoint. I think one of the challenges, and part of what we're trying to achieve with our tuning here is, and some will laugh at this because we clearly failed in some ways in this goal. We actually don't want artifact power to be something that you really seek out in and of itself as its own reward. If you're going to do an activity just to farm AP with no other hope of reward or improvement for your character, I think we've gotten the balance wrong in those ways.
Okay.
Certainly if you're looking at World Quest and you want to get an emissary bag done, and there's a choice between an AP World Quest and a Gold World Quest, and you say, I care more about AP than gold, great. But some of the, specifically a lot of the repeated Mythic Keystone farming that we've seen, where people were doing low difficulty levels, really with virtually no chance, other than the most ridiculously lucky Titan forging, of getting an item upgrade just to grind out AP. Of course, that's not super fun. Doing the same thing over and over again repetitively isn't. We get that. So I think part of what we're doing in 7.2 is changing how lucrative different types of content are, pushing more towards really rewarding you for having done a Mythic Plus in a given week and pushing as far as you can, and taking a lot of that AP out of the end of dungeon chests, so that that's a much less lucrative way to spend your time if you're just looking to, diversify your activities, make your character as strong as possible. On that note, actually, one other thing we're doing with Mythic Keystone AP that probably, I'm not sure if it showed up in this PTR build. If not, it'll be in the next. We're actually continuing to increase the artifact power rewards at 15, 20, and beyond.
Okay.
And also including significantly increasing the artifact power from the end of week chest.
Right.
So I think off the top of my head, I think if you clear a 20 or something at the current knowledge level you're at, you'd likely get something, close to 2 million artifact power out of your weekly chest.
Wow.
And so again, because it's more fun to push higher difficulty levels than to repeatedly do the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
And also those higher difficulty levels actually stand a much better chance of rewarding your character with loot. So I think in terms of our overall goals, we're looking to move players away from feeling like the right thing to do is to repeatedly grind the same content to get artifact power. Also making, a system of true diminishing returns rather than just racing to an endpoint where I think for everybody, I think again, as Josh recently said in a forum post, yes, the intent is that you get to a point where you say, wow, it's really not worth this many hours of focused gameplay just to get an extra 0.5%, when I could take that time if I wanted to and level up my off-spec weapon to 95% of where my main spec weapon is at, to play an alt, or to just do something else other than World of Warcraft. That's totally okay too.
Yeah. Yeah, the goal is not to make you spend every single waking moment in Mauve Souls.
Yeah,
So.
and it's grappling, and we're definitely grappling with a wide range of player psychology that I think for the vast majority of players, the system works fine because they just sit back and they take the artifact power as it comes and they enjoy having goals. But of course, I understand the competitive min-max mindset, where if there's a goal put in front of you, it feels mandatory. It feels like something you have to strive towards.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to balance the system out to work for everybody as best as possible.
Yeah. I had another thought on that, but I don't remember what it was now. So we're just gonna move on.
Sorry, long rambling response, but
it's cool. We got more AP questions anyway. So here's one from Arcanon, who asked, wouldn't it be better to make AP class wide? Why must I gather all AP from the beginning for every specs weapon and stay far behind according to other players?
So I think part of it is according to other players is, I think, a big part of that question. So the reason why AP isn't class wide is the way the system was presented. It is about your artifact. It's about infusing your artifact with power, making choices about which traits you're unlocking in that specific weapon. I suppose there's a different version where we could have empowered your forge or empowered your character in a different way, but there's something that felt a little odd about, having played, let's say, Holy Paladin exclusively, but then picking up your Ashbringer for the first time, and it's just automatically equally powerful, fully spec'd out, and you just kind of had all of that happen in the background. What we're instead, I think, focusing on changing is significantly narrowing the gap. So using some of the examples that we've gone through earlier, in a world where we continue exponential gains with knowledge alongside it, back in with the way the curve works, if you have spent twice as much time as I have gathering artifact power, your weapon should be around 3 points ahead of mine, and that is around 1.5% stronger. But there's no difference between you've spent twice as much time gathering artifact power or you've put all your artifact power into one weapon while I've split mine evenly between two. And so in that case, if I think this is an example I used directly in my forum post, if you're 100%, all your points are in Destro, my points are half split between Af and Destro, you'll have a 44-point artifact, I'll have two 41-point artifacts. And that's not far behind. That's a tiny bit behind. And actually, in a lot of situations, if I play both specs equally well, my flexibility to choose the spec that's best suited for a given situation will mean that in many situations, I outperform you, all else being equal in terms of gear or skill, because of that flexibility. And that's up to every player to make that choice, whether they prefer playing multiple specs, whether they want to focus on just one because it's what they enjoy. But the reward for focusing on one is a small one. And that's very different from how it is in the game today, where if I'm 54 points in one spec and you split evenly between two, you might be at 43 or 44 points in those specs, and that feels much farther behind and like you're significantly disadvantaged.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good point to mention the change to the final trait that just hit the 7.2 PTR, which is still being tuned, by the way. It's not, the actual numbers on that are not final at all. But even already, it's a difference of where, like, right now, the difference of being 10 points behind in your final trait in 715 is that's 5% raw damage. Being 10 points behind is like a few hundred stats or something like that.
Well, it's a few hundred stats on a proc. That's not always up. It's not. The intent is for each point to be a bit less impactful, and again, for people to reach points where they make trade-offs, make decisions about what they'd rather work on next. I think when people were unlocking their initial artifact and getting their golds, we saw a lot of people, before knowledge had ramped up around like knowledge 11 or 12 or so, a lot of people got their third gold trait and looked ahead at the road of, kind of ignored utility traits that they'd skipped along the way that they would have had to get, and decided, wow, this is a great time for me to work on my off-spec weapon or do something else, because it doesn't feel worth spending the whole week filling this bar just to get, 2% reduced damage while in Ghost Wolf or whatever,
right,
when there's something else that you could have gotten instead. And I think this is all about trying to get back to that place that felt very healthy overall. That open-ended progression at the end exists not to be a mandatory power goal that we're going to tune around, but rather something for people who want to keep running artifact power as an outlet for it, so that the currency, so that the reward continues to always have some value when you get it through doing other content.
Cool. And just to mention again, just in case it got missed in there, the goal is that the individual increases are significantly smaller with the new trait in 7.2, so that you don't feel like 5 points behind is, well, don't even bother bringing me to the raid.
Exactly.
Cool. Next question. Oh, this is a pretty straightforward one. It's great, from Penny Rush, who asked, with 7.0 AP items being unusable on empowered artifacts, what will happen with Suramar AP rewards?
Nothing. So it's not that 7.0 AP items are unusable. It's that AP items acquired with a knowledge level of 25 or lower are unusable once you've empowered your artifact in 7.2. Process of empowering your artifact will also give you knowledge level 26 and unlock the rest of that progression. And it's a little bit, it's admittedly heavy-handed. It's not the most elegant design.
Right.
But basically, this is just us trying to protect players from themselves. Otherwise, you'd be walking around with hoarded bags and banks full of artifact power items until 7.2 comes out. And that's just annoying. No one really wants to feel obligated to do that.
Yeah, especially for a lot of these players, having just grinded out 5 million Maw of Souls runs. It's not that many. It's more like a few hundred, but still. Having done a ton of Maw of Souls, They've been grinding out their artifact power. They've finally gotten to 54, and they're like, okay, I'm finished. We didn't want them to then feel like, all right, well, keep doing that for
exactly. And I think it's yes. I think it's not. We think it's a problem that players felt like they needed to grind in that way. And we're trying to change the system so that it feels different the next time around.
Yeah.
But recognizing the system that we have, yes, we'd like to give you a respite from the current 7.0, 7.1 era grind, because that was not fun in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on. Question here from Corcall, who asked, are there any plans to extend the artifact knowledge Ketchup in 7.2 to follow the same trends as the compendiums added in 7.1.5? Or is that something for a later date? So talking about the items you can purchase on, say, your main character, and then send to an alt to catch them up on artifact knowledge. Are we extending that in 7.2?
Yes, we're planning to introduce new knowledge 30, 35, etc. tomes in 7.2.
So does that go all the way up to 40? So if you're at 40, you can buy a 35?
That's the current plan, yes.
Cool. Awesome. That'll be really, really cool. Question from Artunius, who asked, the tier 20 set bonuses seem quite lackluster as a whole compared to tier 19. Thoughts on that? So I mentioned something on the PTR forums, I think it was yesterday, about this a little bit, just that these are not final. These are still very much in development.
And my thoughts on that are, you're right to an extent. I think your work, and that's a comparison between tier 19 set bonuses that were initially present in beta, iterated on multiple times. Many of them were changed significantly in 7.1 before they actually saw the light of day, to literally first pass ideas that you're seeing stubbed in to get feedback. And there's already a lot of changes that have been made as a result of that feedback. And that back and forth process is part of how we improve the quality overall. It's part of the expected process.
And to give a little context to this, just kind of feeding into the way our development process works a little bit, especially when you're seeing something primarily through data mining, because obviously the tier 20 gear isn't testable right now. When you're seeing something primarily through data mining like this, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but more or less what happened is someone sat down and said, I need to make some tier items. I'm just going to put some set bonuses in here. Maybe they're more familiar with some classes, maybe they're less familiar with others. And then as time goes on, because we have a very iterative and very collaborative design process, someone else's job is to later go in and say, okay, this one that you came up with for Shadow Priest doesn't really fit their kit very well. Let's change it like this or something.
Yeah, I think it's the nature of any brainstorming process. I think, it's the item team, the class team are getting together, they're talking, people are brainstorming for classes that they're most familiar with, circulating them, sharing them around internally, getting feedback, and we come up with a list of bonuses for all the different specs. And with any version of that type of system, when someone asks you, hey, come up with 72 ideas, because that's what this essentially is, they're not all going to be equally good.
Yeah.
There are some that you have that were just really elegant slam dunks, you're excited about them, your confident players are going to be too. There are others where you're just sitting there racking your brain for a while, couldn't come up with something great, but you wanted to get something on paper and move along. And you're going to revisit it later on.
Yeah.
And once we get to that point where we have this list, we don't want to hold back the whole list rather than get them out in players' hands to start getting feedback. So we know that some of them are not up to the same standard as some of the others, but it also gives us a chance to get discussions started with players. And maybe, there are often times where we'll see an idea come up in a forum thread or in a response about something that could be changed about one of the bonuses that makes it more exciting.
Yeah.
And we'll go back and incorporate that. Also, with the way PTR works, a lot of our internal workflow and our pipeline for handling data and making builds, there actually isn't a whole lot of filtering on it. It's really designed to help us get content made and get content into players' hands, whether for testing or for just retail gameplay, as quickly as possible. And so, a designer stubs something in on Thursday, that's in the build. That's just, like it or even if it's not ready for prime time. And like Josh said, it's not on a PTR vendor somewhere.
Yeah.
It's in the files, and we don't have multiple different branches, and we're not 7 builds ahead internally from what you're seeing usually, as long as we're in a regular release cadence. So that means that plenty of times we might see something in data mining and wonder, like, what the hell are these guys thinking? This clearly this can't be right. This can't be finished. Yeah, it's not right. It's not finished. And that's why there's so much, we say giant grain of salt when you're taking any data mine stuff into account, because experiments, abandoned designs, all of those things are in the data. And it's not. We don't think it's worth our effort to go back and clean them up or go out of our way to hide them from data miners when we could spend that time making new cool stuff.
Right.
But the result is that there's, often this bit of uncertainty and apprehension, which is why we try to, tamp down those concerns wherever possible.
Yeah. And it's always worth sharing feedback, but just keep in mind when you look at something and say, what designer in their right mind thought this was a good idea? The answer is no one. They just put something there. So cool. Next question from Forum Troll, who I checked and was actually a troll on the forums. So very committed to his craft. Who asks, since there's now 6 pieces for each tier set, are players expected to wear 2-piece plus 4-piece combinations come 7-2, or will that be prevented somehow?
So we added 6 pieces. We made the tier set 6-piece for 2 reasons in Legion. One, it's actually, we think it's kind of cool artistically having a cloak that fits the overall look and set. And, from a transmog perspective, there's something nice about that. But also, we knew that Legendaries were coming into play. And if you have, legendary gloves and legendary pants as your best legendaries you prefer to wear, well, obviously that precludes you from now completing a traditional 4 out of 5 set.
Right.
The 6th piece is there for that flexibility. We don't currently have any plans to forcibly restrict or make the 2-piece and 4-piece from the successive tiers mutually exclusive, though I think a lot of people are going to find that if you have a really powerful legendary that fills any of those slots, you need to make some hard choices about exactly what you want to put together. We generally make the 4-piece bonuses stronger than the 2-piece bonuses. That's not always the case, but it generally is. And so for a lot of people, fitting in those, the Great Pair Legendary Gloves that you have, or the Healer Cloak from Karazhan is probably going to be worth not necessarily having that double set bonus. For others, it might be. I think that's an interesting gearing choice overall. If it ends up feeling degenerate or like there's only one right answer, we might revisit that, but don't currently expect that right now.
Okay. Cool. Next question comes from D Knight Exo, who asked, do you intend to release proper tank trinkets? Currently, most tanks are best off getting stat sticks or stat proc trinkets. The limitations on the tank trinkets make them unusable.
I guess I challenge the underlying premise a little bit. I think looking at Nightmare, there are a couple of grotesque statuette, the vial. There are a few trinkets that have been very successful and very valuable and very widely used by a lot of tanks. Obviously, passive stuff, passive mitigation, passive stats, they're always the most reliable.
Yeah.
When you have, some activated ability that's a defensive cooldown, either that can be a pain to use in some situations, or depending on the fight, there may not be a clear-cut case where it's giving you a huge advantage given the type of damage that you're facing or the moments where you're most at risk, and you feel better off just having a larger health pool overall, or having something that's going to let you put out more damage if you're not worried about dying. So I think we're certainly always looking to make interesting and engaging tank trinkets. Welcome feedback about the ones that have been most successful and most fun to use. I think we're actually currently iterating on some of the trinkets in Tomb of Sargeras in patch 7.2. So all you data miners, and I mean they'll be in the Dungeon Journal too. But keep an eye out for those. I'm curious to hear what the general thoughts are, and we will do our best to respond. And ultimately, we want the items to be exciting. Obviously, strength and mastery or something as passives are always going to be good. That's never going to be a bad trinket, but it's not necessarily the most exciting one. We always find it best and most successful where there's an alignment between what's best and what's most fun.
Yeah. It's worth mentioning as well, because I was having a conversation about this with the couple of item designers that are working on these, or that are working on trinkets in general. I had mentioned a while back that we were going to take a pass and look through the tank trinkets. I mentioned on the forums a while back that we were going to look through tank trinkets. We did that and sort of came to the conclusion that the issue from a lot of players, and please do correct me if I'm wrong on this one, this is just our current thinking, the issue isn't necessarily that the trinkets are undertuned, it's that a lot of players prefer those stat sticks and the passive stat trinkets, and not necessarily as excited about the let's say a little bit more complex ones that are in Nighthold.
And I think that's something that we've looked at in our general trinket design that I think may bear some revisiting. Historically, when a trinket is activated versus a proc or passive, the control usually incurred a sort of a budget penalty.
Right.
And a lot of that was driven by raw DPS trinkets, right? If you have the ability on use, like give yourself a bunch of int, well, the reality is you're probably going to macro that in with your other cooldowns, and there's an extra effectiveness that comes from being able to guarantee that it's lining up with everything.
Right.
But for almost every other type of trinket, especially healer or tank ones, or ones that are more nuanced in their use, it's not nearly as simple. It's either an extra keybind or the presence of mind to think, oh, this is the situation where I should push this button right now because it's going to be the right thing for myself, my own survival, for my raid survival. And that's almost an extra tax on your awareness and your execution. And so maybe rather than even having a penalty, there should actually be a bonus to the power of trinkets that ask that of the player, rather than just saying, hey, you have these passive stats. I mean, that's kind of what we do with talents. If there's a passive talent that always works and is always solid in the same row as one that requires an extra keybind and a button press in your rotation, we usually make it so that the extra keybind and button press, if used correctly and if used very well, offers slightly more throughput than the passive option. Obviously, if you take it and screw it up, then you're going to be worse off, but that's part of your own choice.
Okay, cool. Next question from Silent Hit, who asked, what was the design idea behind the new group buffing traits? Seems odd to give them to some instead of all specs.
I mean, I think this is just a part of flavor and trying different things. I think there's a handful that felt like they resonated with stats that specific specs had often been attuned with or associated with, like Fire Mages and Crit, or harkening back to some of the group buffs that we eliminated back in the day. It's just a little bit of flavor and knowing and appreciating that, oh, hey, there's a Shadow Priest around. I'm getting a little bit of extra haste. The budget values we're talking about here as a single trait and artifact are relatively modest. So it's more for flavor than anything else. We're not actually expecting people to alter their group compositions or stack groups for this. But it's just difference in flavor rather than having everything be cut from the same template.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting as well. Like it's cool to have that feeling of, oh, I've got a fire mage, so I'm gonna have some extra crit, or I've got it's one of the shamans. I think it's enhancement shaman that gives you extra. I don't remember exactly what the trait was off the top of my head right now, but I think it's kind of cool to have that sort of like little extra. I'm with this person. Ooh, that's the nice little extra bonus sort of feeling.
Yep.
Cool. Next question from Gilnorian, who asked, Mythic Raiders seem to be burning out faster than ever due to the grind. Are there any plans to address that?
So, I think some of it is a lot of what we've talked about earlier on about artifact power and how we want to shift it away from feeling like there's this expectation, like there's a finish line that you have to reach in order to be up to the standard that is expected, and anything short of that is deficient, and more of this sliding scale of diminishing returns. All of that said, I think being in and running a Mythic Raiding Guild is really hard. It's an incredible drain on your time. It's an emotional drain. And guilds have risen and fallen throughout the history of World of Warcraft. Remember back in Sunwell Plateau when Death and Taxes announced that they were, disbanding or ceasing competitive raiding, and
then the
people
next
thought
day,
this
World
guy
of
was
Warcraft died.
Yeah, exactly. And there's, oh my God, what's going on? Or on the heels of their success, Nihilum and SK Gaming merged to form Insidia, or whether it's any number of guilds that have walked away from the game, come back. What that tends to reflect is not 20 or 25 or 40 people saying collectively we're done. It's the officers, the leaders that are the lifeblood of the guild that keep the guild going, reaching a point where in their own lives, due to their own circumstances, the time they've played the game, what they feel the game means to them, or changes that we've made that have made it less attractive to them, they feel like they can't go on. Every guild, I think, has gone through countless ones of these decision points where it's in the hands of the officers and the leaders to put in the effort, to put in the extra sweat and tears to save and rebuild the guild, or to go on a recruitment push, or to rally the troops and keep pushing forward, or to walk away, which is really tempting because it's such an emotional drain. And guilds live and die and rise and fall in the hands of their leaders and their officers. And what we commonly see when, those key people want to take a step away, a guild may fall apart, but a large portion of the people in the guild who are still looking to keep playing, keep progressing at a competitive level, go spread out and join other hungry guilds that are still growing and pushing. And that's how we've seen a lot of, the change at the top over the years. And it's a testament to, the long-running success of some guilds like Method that you've seen in those upper echelons, going all the way back to, Serpentine Cavern days. And that's particularly impressive.
Yeah, definitely. It is worth reiterating as well, like, you're not trying to say here that no, it's fine or everything, because obviously there is a bit of that element of a grind that we're trying to help address in 7.2, but that's an issue that's felt by many segments of the player base, probably most keenly by the top end Mythic Raiders, but it's definitely
absolutely. I'm definitely, thank you. I realized what I probably said sounded in a lot of ways like I was trying to say, like, oh no, nothing's changed. It's always been like this. Raid leaders get burned out and quit. That's always been the case. For sure, what Artifact Power did, and what at times the perceived legendary grind before we changed a lot of the diminishing returns and stuff there and actually flattened it out, what that did was harmful to Mythic Raiders in particular, given their ethos. And we are working actively to improve that in 7.2, and really earnestly hope and believe that it will be different and better. All of that said, and now to put myself back in hot water, I'm going to put a little bit of blame on some of the leaders and the members of these guilds, where there may be a level of what's required to be competitive that isn't sustainable. And it's not the right thing for our game or for our game design to support that actively.
Okay.
On some level, no, the game's not meant to be played 80 hours a week.
Yeah.
And, I remember I was talking about Sunwell Plateau. I remember it was controversial at the time when the Muru Gate came down, to unlock the 5th boss of Sunwell Plateau. And a couple of guilds, I think back then it was Exodus, SK Gaming, they did these marathon raiding sessions, and they raided, 23 hours over the course of 2 or 3 days and got their world firsts or US firsts. And at the time, I remember there was a thread on the EU forums asking, should there be attempt limits? Should there be limits on the hours that someone can put in? Because otherwise, this is just going to become this arms race of more and more and more time commitment. And obviously, I think we tried attempt limits here and there. We tried them in Wrath, but that led to its whole separate set of frustrations. I think the answer we saw to attempt limits in Icecrown Citadel was, okay, we'll just have 2 or 3 alt raids, and you burn our alt raid attempts to learn the fights before we switch to our mains.
And meanwhile, everybody else is getting stuck behind this attempt limit and having issues.
But it's an arms race. And I think there are plenty of guilds that take a step back from that. And they say, well, no, that's crazy. We're not going to do that. They pride themselves on being 3-night-a-week, 4-night-a-week guilds. We don't add extra days during progression. No, we don't require a stable of geared alts if you want to be a member of our group. We don't do lots of split runs. But then at the same time, those guild leaders and those guilds that are making this choice, they are saying, no, it's not reasonable to spend this much time in pursuit of these goals. Also have this expectation of, well, if you want to be a part of our main roster, if you don't want to be benched, if you don't want to be kind of peer pressured and shunned, well, you better be spending the 20 hours that we're not raiding chain running Maw of Souls every week. And again, the fact that was a thing that could be done is a problem.
Yeah.
We want to fix it so that that's not this ridiculous path of least resistance to an unfun experience.
Yeah.
But why is that different? Why is it that a group that will say, no, it's unreasonable of us to ask a 5th night of the week of our raiders' time in pursuit of our progression goals will happily enforce and require 5 times that much time investment on people's personal time outside of scheduled hours? And I think we want to make a game that has goals and ways for people who want to spend a lot of time to work towards, whether you're playing multiple alts or whether, usually you have limited playtime, but you have a week of vacation this week. And you just want to go crazy playing a lot of WoW. And that's what you're looking forward to. So we shy away from lots of hard gates and hard restrictions on things. I mean, we have kind of the core one of you can only kill a raid boss once a week and get loot from it, because otherwise you would just grind the same boss over and over again.
Yeah.
But if your friend wants to run a dungeon on a Sunday night, we want there to be a reason for you to say, yeah, sure, I'll tank that for you. Sure, I'll come along, and not feel like you're doing it solely out of pure altruism.
Right.
But yes, that means that, doing it multiple times will continue to give you rewards, and we're asking players to some extent, limit and manage their own time investment. And it's an area that's challenging. I know at the high end of the competitive community, it's an arms race and people push each other. And there's always this sense of when you have comparable skill levels, well, if we just put in a bit more time, if we just geared up a few more alts, if we just did a bit more, that will push us ahead. But as many of the guilds and players walking away from the scene attest, I don't know that it's sustainable. And that's it's something. It's a discussion that I'd love to continue. I'd love to continue on the forums and with other members of the high end rating community. So yeah, just rambling thoughts.
No, it's always interesting to hear the thoughts behind things. We are just about out of time, so we're just going to do one more quick question here real quick. This one came from Reeves Rift, who said, some world quests do not feel worth it, for example, rewarding 50 gold. Have you considered allowing those rewards to Warforge or Titanforge to up the reward?
Wait, another layer of RNG added? No. Yeah, actually, that's a cool idea. I think because we love RNG in all its forms, right? That's how it works. But no, it's a couple of ideas we've considered. There are crit gold or artifact power gains, just so that you did this thing for this currency type that you were seeking out. Sometimes it was better. Something else we've considered is actually not hiding it behind a random chance, but rather having some world quests that just up front are extra lucrative.
Okay.
I think that's something that we've lost a little bit in the system right now that was present back in September last fall, where you'd mouse over all the world quests on the map, and oh crap, there's a relic or there's a trinket that I really need, and I don't care if I have an emissary for that zone or if I need the rep from that one. I'm going to go do that because the reward in particular is special and exciting to me. And right now, I think it all kind of blurs together, and you mostly do world quests based on emissaries, or if you want artifact power, you do those, but you don't really care about the denominations or the amounts. Whereas if randomly a 3,000 gold world quest popped up, or a 500,000 artifact power world quest popped up, or a world quest that gave you a baseline 875 item instead of having to hope for Titan forging popped up, you might go out of your way to do that. Something we're working on. The tech that we have in place doesn't totally cleanly support it right now, but it's something that we've talked about a lot and would like to do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today and answering these questions.
Thank you for the great questions.
And shouting at guilds. That was great.
Sorry.
Again, we're going to be back here in just a couple of weeks with Brian Halinka to talk PvP, so please keep an eye out for that announcement to come up here very, very soon. But until next time, thanks again, and we'll see you guys later.
Take care. Enjoy the rest of the day.